Welcome, welcome to Freaked Out with your psychic medium host, Liz. That's me. OMG, guys. I cannot tell you how excited I am to record this episode today. So much to talk about. Wow. I literally stopped everything I was doing and just had to post this because it was so crazy. Now, I do want to give a shout out to my Facebook group. They are the ones who brought this case forward to me. And after looking at it and watching the documentary, I can see why. Let me tell you, this documentary called The Fox Hollow Murders scared the living bejesus out of me. And I mean, considering what I do on a daily basis, it takes a lot to get me there. And this documentary starts off very, very, very slow and talks about all these crazy things. And then they bring out Mark in the last episode or the last couple of episodes, and OMG. It took me on a wild ride, and I cannot wait to share everything we felt on this. I honestly feel like I'm in a completely different dimension. You can always tell when I enjoy giving you guys an episode because the information just flows right out of me. So Landon and I were watching this documentary this week, and you can instantly see Mark and how he changes from one personality to another. It is a very clear depiction of DID, but there's also a lot of lies that he spewed, and he's trying to protect himself. There's just a lot. I know a couple of people with DID. In fact, one of them is like a really close friend of mine. And normally those switches don't happen that fast. I've never seen it anyway. But it's because the trauma is so deeply embedded in his head that these switches will come out so quick. Every alter will just come out rapidly. And a fully different personality just comes out as well. Now, I didn't catch all of the personalities, but there were a few. There were a few in there that we were able to catch on to and find information out, but we'll talk about that a little later in the episode. Speaking of Landon, he was actually so sick this week. Poor guy. He is finally feeling better. So if you guys want to mention something in the comment section, I'll make sure to let him know. And he will be here for next week's episode, and I cannot wait. But let me tell you, I feel like I will never sleep again. After watching this documentary, Mark haunts my dreams. And honestly, I don't know. I don't think this documentary would have gotten as many views as it did if we didn't have that last little bit with Mark. So it's a good thing they got him on there. Speaking of documentaries, in case you guys don't know, it is on Hulu. I'm not exactly sure where else it is, but that is where it is available in the US. I highly recommend watching this documentary before and after. So even just the last episode, so you can see the switches I'm referring to. But for reference, I will throw a picture of Mark up right now so that you guys can get a full view of him for just a minute while we get this episode going. This case does not start with Mark Goodyear, unfortunately. The case actually starts with Herb Baumeister. He is the OG killer in this case. He's really one of those typical Southern gay man / gay hating, gay bashing murderer from back in the day. I did want to mention as well before we get started on this episode that next week we will be doing Ruby Franke. We have never covered Ruby Franke at all on the podcast, on YouTube, anywhere. We might have made a very small video on TikTok, but it's been a minute and we're going to cover it. Now, when it comes to Ruby Franke's case, I'm not going to be covering any of the stuff that happened with the kids because I think that that's just been heavy and unnecessary. But I want to talk about all of the things that her and Jody have done behind the scenes, because I think there's a lot of things that have yet to be said. And I see that more than anything else, Ruby is hella afraid that all of these details are going to come out about her. That's how bad it is. She would rather people think that she has abused her children in the most feral way than to ever admit to any of the things she has done in the background. So you guys will not want to miss that episode either, especially all the stuff with Jody. Woo! Anyways, we'll be back next week for that one. Back to Herb Baumeister, a typical self-hating cisgender white male. And from what I can see, although he had these urges to kill, he also had urges of being with other men, and he hated himself for it. In fact, because he was so in the church, he really believed that he would go to hell anyway. So he felt like, you know what? I'm going to make a promise to God, and I'm going to kill every sexual deviant man out there, and I'm going to save myself in doing so. That was his logic in this situation. But in reality, it was just a dress to throw on top of the fact that he actually enjoyed killing, unaliving, all that jazz. I did want to mention as well that obviously back in the day, the police officers didn't really give a shit about gay rights, gay community, trans rights, trans community, nothing. Unless you're white, they don't really care, to be honest. Like, yes, of course, there are far and few between officers, good ones, good officers that really do genuinely care. But these particular officers in this particular location, they didn't give two shits, and I don't really think they care too much now. There might be one or two, but really in reality, the vast majority, not so much. But I also believe that the police also have a connection to this case as well. So just keep that in mind for a little later in this episode. I also think that Herb thought he was unstoppable because he was, doing God's work. And because the police didn't really give two shits, it worked hand in hand with what he was doing, which is why he was so cocky and confident that he would never get caught. This case runs deeper than I anticipated. There are very notorious serial killers in and around that area that also have an association with this unsolved case. It's maddening. All right, where did this all begin? This actually began at Fox Hollows, which is a farm. Somebody had actually asked me the other day if there was a place that I would not want to go to. There are many places on this earth that I have zero desire to go to. But this particular farm scares the bejesus out of me. Even just trying to channel the situation in my own home, it made me very sick, drained, uncomfortable. I think that if I ever went to that farm, I would not walk out feeling like the same person I am today because of the overwhelming emotions and hate and anger and aggression that is there. Oof, I don't recommend it. If you guys have ever watched The Little Mermaid, where Ariel goes and talks to Ursula about becoming a human, and she walks through her little cave, and you know how there's all the people that made contracts with Ursula were trying to grab onto her as she was walking through. That is exactly what would happen to me in abundance. Like, they would not let go. It would be traumatizing. I don't recommend anyone going on this property, like nobody. Good luck. I wouldn't even pass by this location. But you know me, I can't pass up something as crazy as this. So make sure to like this video. Let's get into Herb. Richard Baumeister was born April 7th, 1947, which makes him an Aries. His birthday is just a few days before mine. He was actually the oldest of 4 kids in his family. And his family came from like a middle-class family. And his father was an anesthesiologist. I did want to mention that I think that may have been a point of curiosity. Yes, he definitely had interests in animals, dead animals, all that stuff. But initially, I think there was something that happened with his father where his dad may have talked about someone dying on the table. I'm not exactly sure, but there was like an instant fascination from Herb. And I think that dad would, see that he had interest and he thinks, oh, wow, my kid has interest in what I'm doing. Maybe this is something he'll want to do when he's older. No, but he did talk a lot about life and death with his son, which piqued his fascination a lot more. As a child, he exhibited odd behavior. He really developed his interest in dead animals at that point. And he would place them in ways that would concern adults, which I couldn't even imagine even touching a dead animal, let alone placing it in a position where, it's artistic, at least from his perspective. I do see that he was not only interested in the way they died, how they died, he was also very interested in their bodies. He liked to do investigations to see how they died. And I hate to say this, but a lot of those animals he was killing himself. He would give them bleach. He would give them anything toxic he could find in the house and slowly watch them die. I even feel like he would play with them like they were Barbie dolls. Oh no, I'm going to get you. No, I'm going to get you. Action figures, whatever you want to call it. It's a very, very odd situation. He didn't have that gene of empathy. His family was his wife eventually was the kids too were all everybody in his family thought his behavior was very unusual from the absolute beginning. Now, when he got older, he ended up going to university in Indiana, but he didn't graduate. He did, however, work many different jobs and eventually opened up multiple businesses, an antique store / thrift store, and they called it Save a Lot. And they actually had a few chains as well. From what I see, although this was something he really enjoyed, he was really looking for a place where he could potentially store or stack dead animals. I don't know. I feel like there's an association to his earlier years in crime where he enjoyed putting these dead animals and maybe even dead people in another location where he didn't have to take it home. Now, from what I gather, the reason that he was totally obsessed with mannequins is because it reminded him of his first dead body that he had seen. I see a young little version of him. I see that kid at a funeral parlor and I see him just being totally intrigued and in fact would not leave this dead body alone. Pretty obsessive, even asking extremely inappropriate questions. In his mind, mannequins, dead bodies look very similar. With mannequins, he couldn't really get in trouble, so thus the fascination began. He also enjoyed something about it. It's they couldn't talk back, very similar to a dead body, and he incorporated mannequins throughout his hunts of all of his victims. He would play with them all the time and have conversations with the mannequins, giving them names. For instance, when he would torture some of these people, he would have full-blown conversations with the people he was torturing whilst taping them. But also, he would talk to the mannequin and then be like, aren't you going to talk to the mannequin too? And the guy that he was, hurting would be like, what in the hell are you talking about? And the more that you would not give in to Herb, he would punish you more. But the people that would play along, he really enjoyed that and would not have them suffer as bad. But then again, not in reality, they were suffering one way or another. But in his mind, he was more humane with those who followed suit. And from what I can see, he took those mannequins before he even started killing people and would rehearse what he was going to do to them as well. I'd like to know where the hell everybody was during all this. Where was his parents? Where was his wife? Where was everybody? Why is he alone all the time doing all this? You know what I'm saying? He's got like a bunch of kids. Like, it's just very odd. Now, as you guys know, I collect dolls to channel certain spirits, and like mannequins, they can be haunted and possessed by spirits and entities. So they carry a lot of that. And I'm not referencing every single mannequin, but more so the older ones. It also seems to be a thing. From what I gathered from Eileen Wuornos, mannequins and being obsessed with mannequins are not far-fetched when it comes to being a serial killer, but not all of the people, not all of the serial killers have the time, the leisure, the space to have mannequins. And don't worry, guys, not all mannequins are haunted. It's more so the ones that are like old, left alone, are not being used for clothing anymore. Reused ones, really. No, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. There are entities, but 99% of them do not get haunted by entities. Entities take a lot to get haunted by. We'll talk about that one day. Well, as we know, Herb went on in his life, and he actually ended up marrying a woman by the name of Juliana. And he actually married her in 1971, and they had 3 kids. Again, nobody saw any of this. Despite having children and a wife, he was still gay, which led to his double life. I do want to also mention that I know right now we're in an era where trans rights are being taken away, gay rights are being taken away. There are so many claims that this is like devil and evil and all that. No. The devil and evil is preventing people from being who they are. Imagine how many people in the world would just get to be themselves. So far-fetched. All right, let's talk about Julie here for a moment, because I think it's important. I know this woman is acting like she didn't know stuff, and she might not have known to the full extent of what her husband was doing, and I get all that, because yes, there are people that have double lives. But I do believe that she had suspicion very early on in the relationship, not only with him being gay, but also with all of the death and murders. I even see that before they got married, I think he actually kissed another man, and I think she walked in on it and decided to marry him anyway. I think it was someone fairly close to her and her family, maybe a brother or cousin and uncle, I'm not sure, but it looks like they went ahead with the wedding anyway. And of course, that's going to play on her mind for years on end. From what I can see, he was totally checked out of the relationship. And she really struggled with that as well. She did spy on him quite a bit, but then gave up on all of that and just took care of her kids and kind of dealt with it until she walked away from him later on. And I see that she would just snuff her nose at it and say, oh, everything's fine. My family is wonderful. Nothing's happening here. I even think she might have gotten herself a lover at some point. He might have been the one to really convince her of what was going on. I also believe that she witnessed some scary behavior, and I see that the box of tapes that he had, which by the way, he had hundreds of them, I feel like her and her lover went snooping, turned it on, and watched the horror. I even feel like he was afraid for her life as well. Everybody was, really, but everyone kept it quiet because he wasn't getting caught. Nothing was happening. She saw police officers around too. She felt like she was in a situation she couldn't escape from, but kept quiet for her own life and her children's lives. I even feel like she's still scared to this day, even after Herb's death. You know, I just don't feel like she is going to ever talk about all of what she saw and witnessed due to fear. By the way, I wanted to give a shout out to Eileen Wuornos for reaching out to this guy, because I don't like talking to those crazies. So thank you, Eileen, for helping out. Love to give a shout out when shout outs due. Unfortunately, I don't have all the details of when he started to murder people, but they do have it set up between 1980 and 1990. Again, mostly young males, mostly gay men. And because they were all disappearing in the Indianapolis area, nobody gave 2 shits. I do, however, believe that they have the date slightly wrong. I think that he did his first murder in 1970. But yeah, majority in the 80s. They found at least 11 men buried on Fox Hollow Farm. Now, let's keep in mind, when they got a tip about this and started to genuinely look into it, they didn't even arrest him after they found bodies on the property. And of course, he fled to Canada as this was all unfolding. He wasn't going to jail. He refused to go to jail. And that is where he died by suicide, and he did not confess to any of these murders, which also just shows how confident and cocky he was in all of this. From what I gather, there were many more bodies. But also, not every person that died at Fox Hollow Farm was, in fact, from Herb. Some of them were from other people, but we'll talk about that here soon. Now, let's talk about Mark Goodyear's role in all of this. Now, Mark had actually reported to the police hearing disturbing information from Herb and involving his behavior. His tips did contribute to them finding, but he didn't share everything. And he was also trying not to incriminate himself. And of course, even when he would call the police, he would never tell them exactly where Herb was, even though he knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. In fact, I feel like there was one specific date and time that he told the police something and he just outrightly refused to give them the location. He was fighting internally in himself because he also had his own involvement. Now let's go back and discuss some things here. Now, Mark did explain that he had seen Herb a few times. He had noticed him. He noticed him because there was something off about Herb, and Mark, also having something off about himself, knew something was wrong with him. Mark explained in the documentary how they met at the missing persons board. I do see that to be very true. Now, Mark didn't explain this part, but Mark was very interested in Herb. He liked the quiet ones because his alters enjoyed the quiet ones. Now, Mark noticed the way that Herb was looking at the missing persons board, and it's like an instant click, because he looked at them that way as well. There was, however, one friend of Mark's that was missing and technically was murdered by Herb, but obviously Mark didn't know this at the time. I do feel like the difference between Herb and Mark is certain alters had remorse and emotion, whereas Herb was just one person with zero remorse, empathy, anything. At this point as well, Mark's alters didn't come out too much. At least not switching as frequently as they do now. It's like they had a mating bond snap into place. Without speaking, they left together. Mark had announced that he had some drugs and the two of them should party together. Mark did suggest for them to go back to his place, but Herb was like, no, we're going to go back to my place. So he went. Now, I believe that Herb and him had conversation on the way to the house, like, I'm not like the normal guys you ever dated. I'm not like the normal guys you ever banged. Like, I do have a lot of secrets, this, that, and the other. And Mark's like, well, we all have a little secret sometime. And I feel like Herb asked him something like, have you ever killed a man? And I think that's when Mark said, yes, I have. And I feel like they confessed that to each other. I think that's when Herb was like, okay, I'm going to kill this guy, but I have somebody to talk to about this as well. He was fascinated about that aspect of it. He had escalated to a point where he was just looking to have conversation about it with somebody. He would often just sit there and watch his videos over and over again and talk to his mannequin. He wanted to have conversations with a human being. Now, Mark can deny it all he wants, because he can, but I don't buy that he wasn't totally intrigued by him. In fact, I feel like Mark was falling in love with Herb right away. It was something about the way that Herb made him feel. even though I don't really feel like anything special happened, Mark just fell for him. It didn't matter what Herb did. Mark saw no wrong. In fact, he had never felt so alive in his life before, which you can see and read off of his face as he talks about it. Mark said that there were bones lying around, and I believe it. I think Herb didn't have them laying about, but I think he pulled them out so that Mark can see what he was capable of. But he fantasizes about that a lot, and you can see that in his brain as he's talking on the interview. So I would say that this is when, after he had done the tour, the two of them had gone back to the poolside, and from what I can see, Herb was planning to kill Mark, but Mark actually gave in and fought back a little bit, and he actually gave Herb a run for his money. In fact, he got out of whatever Herb was doing to him, choking him, hurting him. And then that's when Mark turned the tables on him and said, "This is how I take my prey." And that is when he drugged him. Technically, he had already drugged him a little bit earlier. And then that is when Herb was out for like the 40 minutes because Mark had drugged him and he was smiling at him, waiting for him to open his eyes. Like he was just sitting there staring at Herb and like was like, "You like how I did that? You see what I did there? See, this is my method. This is how I kill people." Now, Mark at this point probably have killed like 2 people. And it was only when somebody was like crossing a line with him, kind of the very same energy Eileen has, like only in a situation where somebody's trying to hurt him. So that's what I get from Mark. That's why a lot of people are conflicted of like what he could do, what he couldn't do. But unfortunately, things escalated with Mark later on. I do believe that the two of them had sex, and I think that Herb taped the whole thing. And then I think Mark noticed it. And although Herb was a lot more aggressive, Mark said he enjoyed it to a degree, even though he really didn't. I think he was just trying to brag. I also believe in that moment, Herb decided to show Mark what he had done, like the actual videos. And that disturbed Mark more than Mark anticipated. And I do believe that that was something tattooed and still in his brain, and it's pretty heavy. But the two of them did have a night of passion and drugs and doing whatever they could to just be involved. Yay, fun. After this night had happened, Mark went to his grandmother's house like he had told everybody. And yes, Herb had followed him home. But he was intrigued by that. He was excited about it. But he also wanted him to come to his house, not his grandmother's house, because he was afraid he would kill her. You know what I mean? Herb did stalk him, but Mark did stalk him back. They were stalking each other because they couldn't have a real relationship. There were no cell phones back then, you know, so they would creep up on each other all the time. And that was something that showed each other that they loved each other. But Mark was scared, but also exhilarated at the same time. And I believe Mark wrote all of these things in a journal somewhere. There were a lot of moments where Mark and Herb would like plan and, you know, bring men back and then kill them. Mark and Herb and others would often play these little sex games. And Mark was learning all of these new ways of killing people, and he was excited. And I mean, Herb was too. The two of them did this. But as time progressed, jealousy got in the way. Mark didn't want to have sex with other people. Mark wanted to just have sex with Herb, and he just wanted Herb to leave his wife. And things started to escalate between the two of them. I also feel like things started to eat away at Mark a little bit more. And I'm not referencing Mark's main persona. I'm talking about his alters, but we'll talk about that here in a moment. Mark isn't on the same level as Herb. Some of his alters are, but not the OG front Mark. There are alters that are a part of Mark that wouldn't even hurt a fly. In fact, they have a hard time even looking at people in the face. It did eat away at Mark more and more often, and he confronted Herb and said, "Look, we don't need to do this anymore. We're getting older. We should just enjoy our lives. We can kill, but we don't need to have sex with people. And Herb was like, I'm not doing that. This is my ritual. This is what I do. This is how I do things. If you don't like it, there's the door. I also see that there were a lot of sex games. You don't do something, you die. Something that Mark was not into at all. And the sex games would happen on the farm, and they would look for them. I see that there were like hide and seek moments, or like, congratulations, you did this deviant act. So now I'll give you 10 seconds before I come after you or shoot at you or scope you. Like, there was so many crazy things that they were doing. Since Mark had a lot of, I don't know, connections, and I think it was because Mark sold drugs. So he had a lot of connections to like normal, regular, everyday serial killers. And I think that's when he got Herb and these serial killers involved with each other. So as you watch the documentary, you can see the different phases of Mark. And we're going to talk about the alters that we picked up on. So again, the main alter, the main person is Mark. That is who was sexually abused. That was who was traumatized, has a hard time approaching men in general. He has always been someone who was abused as a child, and I feel bad for this particular alter. This one is the one who just wants to have a normal life, and it just never goes that way. I even feel like he was even molested by like a grandfather or an uncle, some sort of vibe there. But I do feel for that part of Mark. Now, the one that was fascinated by Herb was who I would call Diablo. Diablo is like a southern gay energy who really hates being gay and any sort of association with gay. And he does not like explaining things more than once. He likes to tell his story one time, and he doesn't share all the details because he knows he made a lot of mistakes. He likes to make the story flow, to make him look like an innocent bystander. He gets very irritated when talking to anyone. And if somebody just seems like they're not as smart as him, he will totally dismiss them or talk down to them. If people don't treat him as if he's some sort of king, then he dismisses them entirely. He is the one who played the games with Herb. He's the one who killed in the past. He is the one who drugged Herb, and he's the very, very bad alter. I would say that he has at least killed 12 people now, and that was all, most of them, with Herb. I don't think he's killing anyone nowadays, but he does like to talk about his glory days. He's very intimidating, and he's the one with the evil laugh. Now, the third alter, an adaptation of a cartoon show, aka South Park, Mr. Garrison. If you hear him in the documentary, you'll hear him say, "Okay, okay, okay." Like, he's done it a few times. Now, he really liked Mr. Garrison from South Park, and I feel like that's where this alter came from. He's kind of like the go-between. He's the one who tries to settle the score. He's like the teacher guy. So if you see his alter come out, he's a little bit more aggressive, but he's not as aggressive as Diablo, and he likes to be the in-between between Mark and Diablo and all the other alters as well. Now, if you watch, you can see all these alters come back, and you can see the switches happen. It's pretty intense. His body language, his facial expression, even just like Mark. Mark does not like being on the camera. Like, you'll see him, he's kind of like this in the corner. But if you look and see, Diablo has no problem being on the camera, and Mr. Garrison's okay with the camera, not as happy as Diablo is. A lot of people have asked me, how does DID happen? Honestly, stems from trauma. The doctors are very right on that. And this personality is born. And from what I see, as you carry on, the more alters you do end up obtaining. And it can be from a young version of yourself to just somebody you don't even know at all. And I know that it's scary to some people who don't understand it, but most people who have alters are not serial killers. You can also obtain an entity, and that entity could also take over and possess your body. It is very possible that Diablo is an entity, but I haven't looked into it. Maybe one day I'll get the answers from Eileen. So what happened between Mark and Herb? Like, why did their relationship go sour? It's simple as that. Mark didn't want to be side piece anymore. He wanted commitment. He wanted him to leave his wife. He wanted to be with him. And when Herb said, I'm not doing that, Mark was like, cool, I'm going to tell everybody your story. It was very dramatic. And then I feel like that is when Herb and Mark started having a lot of fights. And then Mark started going to the police. And yes, he did go to the gay bars and try to warn them all that Herb was going to kill him. And Herb would be laughing in the corner and be like, okay, freak. Yeah, that's my ex. My ex is a psycho, but come home with me anyway. You're not going to get killed, I promise. Mark also found out, and I think he found out by watching one of the videos that Herb had made about his friend. I think it was a guy he actually had a thing for or was in love with. And, you know, they never obviously got to be together. But I think that really affected Mark as well. So Mark was like, well, I don't want people that I love to die. And I think that's where and why he decided to rat him out to the police. At some point, the two of them broke up. I do see that Herb did get violent with Mark at some point and told him to stay away or he was going to kill him too. But Herb definitely was at Mark's house a lot. The two of them did, in fact, watch television together. Herb even thought back then when they were taking out the bones from his house that he would some way, somehow manage to escape it. But he did get a heads up from the police officer that he worked with, and that's why he fled. Why was Herb so confident in not being caught? Well, it's because he had the police. He had a few people that he worked with. And he said, yeah, I'm going to kill this gay person. I'm going to kill this gay person. I'm going to do this, that, and the other. And the police were totally fine with that because they didn't have to get their hands dirty. A lot of cops did, in fact, kill gay men back then just for sport. And I see that a few of these cops made, you know, deals with Herb and would take those bodies and bury them on the farm. Did Mark know what Herb was going to do with Canada, taking the tapes, any of that? Mark was given a heads up that Herb was planning to escape. He did have the boxes with him when he said goodbye to Mark because Mark was like, you know, the last person he had a serious relationship with and he just had to let him know. But yeah, Mark knew of all of it. I do believe, though, that there's a reason that Herb went to Mark's house. I think Herb gave Mark one of the sex tapes. It could have been something between the two of them. It could have been a killing between the two of them, but I believe Mark has a tape currently. I also want to mention that because of this connection between Mark and also the police, they had some connections to some of these serial killers. Now, there are some serial killers that would work for the police, like kill people that the police wanted dead because, I don't know, they looked at them sideways, whatever the case may be. But we'll talk about those individual serial killers another day. But I did want to mention that there are a few serial killers that did have bodies put on Herb's farm. And here's the list. So Larry Eller, he's the interstate killer. He confessed to 21 murders, mostly young men and boys. Interesting. He did confess before he died. He was sentenced to death and he confessed. But I don't think he confessed to everything he had done, including where he put the bodies. Orville Lynn Majors, they called him the Angel of Death. He was convicted of killing 6, suspected of 100 plus. He actually injected elderly patients with fatal doses of potassium chloride. I don't think that the patients were taken elsewhere, but I think there were other murders that he would just do randomly and take them to this farm as well. A couple other things I want to mention before we end this episode today. I have this really creepy feeling that Mark is going to watch this episode. I don't know why, but I mean, I've had a few people watch episodes, you know, like Chris Watts' Mistress, and then she came searching for me. If you don't know about that, I'll talk about it one day. I also have this really disturbing thing in my mind going on. Our trans community has to be careful at this point. I know we want to fight loud and proud, and that's okay, but there's a hit on trans people's heads. So I highly recommend don't go home with strangers at this point. Just be very, very careful because there's some people out there that are part of the MAGA cult that want to murder because of being trans. And I feel like there is a field out there currently with a bunch of trans people being buried, and it looks like they're trying to do, the work of God, getting rid of the abominations, all that crazy shit. But I feel like that's something that will eventually come out too. But just be careful if you are trans. Seriously. Now, Fox Hollow is considered a haunted location, and people go there. I would never. I think it's one of those very, very scary, traumatizing places, and I wouldn't be surprised if something latched themselves onto you. So if you do go there, make sure to sage yourself before you walk into your own home, because those energies you do not want in your house. I truly appreciate you guys being here. Please make sure to subscribe, like, share, become a member on our exclusive content. You won't want to miss it. We just dropped our Matthew Perry episode a couple of days ago. But until next time, guys, stay freaked out.